Hey everyone, ready to dive into something cool. Today, we're all about multi-cloud development, building apps that run on ANY Cloud platform. Yeah, you heard that right, anywhere. No more being tied down to one provider. We're breaking down a blog post by cloud expert Naveen Balani to see how it all works.
Exactly. Imagine building an app once, just once, and deploying it anywhere. That's the beauty of multi-cloud. True freedom.
Okay, sounds amazing, but let's get real. Why is this such a big deal?
Well, think about it. We're swimming in a sea of cloud services, over 100, easy across different platforms, and it just keeps growing. Tons of options, sure, but that also means potential vendor lock-in. Multi-cloud development, it's about breaking those chains. It's about you, the developer, having choices, being able to adapt to changes, get better deals, even meet specific customer needs, like if they're picky about a certain cloud platform.
Right, getting stuck with outdated tech or insane prices because you're locked in, that's a nightmare. So how do we actually make this multi-cloud thing a thing?
Our expert, Naveen Balani, he says containerization is key. He compares it to like those massive shipping containers. You build your app, pack it into that container, and boom, it can run on any ship, well, any cloud platform that supports those containers, of course.
Okay, so we've got our app all packed up, ready to ship, but wouldn't we still hit compatibility issues between platforms? Just because you can physically ship a container anywhere doesn't mean it'll just magically work with the local setup, right?
Exactly, and that's a really important point. Just because services exist across different platforms doesn't mean they're all speaking the same language. We need these services to be truly interoperable, working together seamlessly no matter where they come from. Balani talks about this compatibility doesn't automatically mean interoperability.
So how do we avoid those compatibility headaches? How do we make sure our containers can actually talk to each other?
Choosing the right tools right from the start, that's crucial. If you can, go for those popular open source options. Think of it like a universal travel adapter, right? The more common it is, the more likely it'll work wherever you go. Like databases, for instance. PostgreSQL, it's widely supported across cloud providers. Picking that over something proprietary, something tied to just one platform, that gives you so much more flexibility down the line.
Makes sense. Stick with commonly spoken languages or tools. What about those more specialized services, though? What if there isn't a good open source alternative?
Even then, we can still prioritize flexibility. Balani points to managed services. Think pre-built Lego sets, right?
Yeah.
You get the convenience of pre-assembled parts, but you still have the flexibility to rearrange them if you need to.
Okay, so you're not completely locked in.
Right, like Prometheus, for example. It's
Yeah.
a popular open source monitoring tool. And it's offered as a managed service by Google Cloud and AWS, both. So you can use their pre-built infrastructure, but you know you've got that potential escape route if you ever need to switch providers.
It's like having that safety net, yeah. You get the convenience without the handcuffs.
Yeah.
But what if you absolutely half day to use a service specific to one cloud platform? No other option, open source or managed. It's that or nothing. What then?
That's where Balani brings in API abstraction. Picture this. You've got your TV, DVD player, sound system, all that. Instead of juggling a million different remote controls with different buttons for everything, you've got one. One universal remote to rule them all.
Now you're talking. Tell me more about this universal remote for the cloud.
Basically, you create your own generic APIs. They're like the middlemen, right? Sitting between your application and those cloud-specific APIs. So your application only talks to your generic API, and that API, it translates those commands for whatever specific cloud service you're using.
So if you need to swap out that underlying service later on, you're not stuck rewriting half your application.
Exactly. You only adjust the backend, the implementation, smoother, way less disruptive. It's all about thinking ahead, building in that flexibility from day one.
Yeah,
It's all about having those options open, right? Future-proofing your app as much as you can.
I love it. Like we're building with these swappable parts.
Yeah.
So much freedom. But building in the cloud, especially across different platforms, we got to talk about data, and not just any data. I'm talking about data regulations, how those impact where we can actually store and process sensitive information. Those regulations, man, they can be a maze, and I bet it gets even trickier when you're dealing with multiple cloud providers.
Absolutely. Data governance is key for sure. Balani, he really emphasizes that, having a solid data lifecycle strategy right from the get-go. He talks about thinking about our data in two main categories. You've got PII, that's personally identifiable information, so like social security numbers, passport details, anything that could directly identify someone. And then there's non-PII data, which is, well, everything else. Analytics, clickstream data, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so we know what we're dealing with. How do those categories actually play into our multi-cloud strategy, though?
Well, PII data, regulations around that are really strict, often dictating exactly where you can store it and process it based on the region. Think GDPR in Europe, right? Non-PII data, yeah, it's still subject to regulations, but you usually have a bit more flexibility. Bolani's point is we need to decouple these two types of data right from the beginning. Imagine trying to untangle that mess later on.
Decoupling, keeping them separate. Okay, how do we actually make that happen when we're building an app? This is one of those things that makes sense on paper, but I'm having trouble picturing the actual implementation.
It all starts with how you design your data storage. One approach Bolani talks about is using unique but non-PII identifiers as your primary keys. Instead of using someone's email address, for instance, which is PII, you'd use a random ID number. It's a small change, but it makes a big difference.
I see. So even if that non-PII data linked to that random ID ends up somewhere else, it's not automatically tied to sensitive information. Like it's got that anonymity baked in, even if it's connected behind the scenes.
Exactly. And that separation, it gives you the freedom to process and store that non-PII data on different platforms, even use those specialized services from another provider, all while keeping that sensitive PII data, the really important stuff, secure and compliant on a platform specifically chosen for that.
That's brilliant. It's like having different security zones for your data, each tailored to the specific regulations.
Exactly. You're leveraging the strengths of different platforms and services without compromising security or compliance. Working smarter, not harder.
Right. This data decoupling strategy, this is huge. So we've covered containerization, choosing the right services, API abstraction, and now this clever approach to data. What's the final piece of this multi-cloud puzzle?
The glue that holds it all together, DevOps. It's the behind-the-scenes magic, making sure the development and deployment across all those platforms you've chosen, it all runs smoothly, reliably.
DevOps. It's like one of those words you hear everywhere in tech, but for those of us who don't live and breathe code, it can be a little mysterious. What is DevOps, really? And why is it so crucial when we're talking about, succeeding with this whole multi-cloud approach?
Yeah, you're right. DevOps can definitely get lost in translation, with all the jargon. But basically, at its core, it's about breaking down those walls between the developers and the operations teams. Think of it like a set of practices, tools that streamline that whole software development lifecycle, from writing that very first line of code all the way to deploying and actually managing the application in a live environment.
Right, so it's kind of like the connective tissue for the entire process.
Yeah.
But how does that apply to this multi-cloud world we're talking about, where things get, well, more complex?
Exactly, it gets complicated. Imagine trying to manage all those deployments, updates, monitoring across multiple platforms and without a consistent set of tools and processes. Talk about a nightmare. Bolani, he really emphasizes standardized open source DevOps tools to keep things consistent, no matter which cloud provider you're working with. He specifically mentions Jenkins for CI/CD.
Hold on, CI/CD. Let's break that down a bit. Another one of those tech acronyms.
Right, right. CI/CD, it stands for continuous integration and continuous delivery. Imagine like you're working on a group project, right? Everyone's adding their parts to this shared document, making sure it all flows together, integrates seamlessly. And then that document, it's continuously shared with, whoever it's for, in this case, the users of our application. That's CI/CD, basically automating how those code changes are integrated, tested, and then deployed to the cloud. And Jenkins, it's what helps us orchestrate that whole process in a unified way.
So we're not just throwing updates out there randomly. There's a method, a structure to it all, to keep things running smoothly across all these different platforms.
Exactly. And that structure, it's super important for minimizing errors, speeding up those deployments, and just making sure your application is stable and reliable no matter where it's running. Bolani also talks about Prometheus, which we mentioned earlier for monitoring. Using the same monitoring tools across your different cloud environments, it gives you that unified view of your application's performance, right? Easier to spot and fix issues no matter where they pop up.
So with the right DevOps tools and strategies in place, managing a multi-cloud application, it doesn't seem so overwhelming anymore. It's like having that master control panel, visibility and control across all your environment.
Exactly. It's about working smarter, not harder. Right. And I think that's a great note to end on. We've explored the what and the how of multi-cloud development. We've
Hmm.
talked about the benefits, the strategies to make it work. But as with anything this powerful, it's important to understand not just what it can do, but also when it might not be the perfect fit.
Right, right. We've been really positive about multi-cloud, for good reason. But are there ever times when sticking with just one cloud provider might actually be the smarter move?
Absolutely. Multi-cloud gives you that flexibility, that vendor independence, but it does come with, a bit of a learning curve. Managing applications across multiple platforms takes expertise, robust tools, and yeah, potentially a bigger initial investment.
So for startups, smaller companies, they might not be ready to take that on just yet.
Exactly. Especially in those early stages of a project, sometimes it makes more sense to fully utilize a single provider's ecosystem,
Hmm.
their integrated services, support, expertise. Sometimes that outweighs the need for that multi-cloud flexibility. It's all about choosing the right approach for you, for where you're at.
Makes sense. It's about finding that balance, right?
Hmm.
Figuring out what works best for your needs, for your resources. So as we wrap up our deep dive here,